Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game. I'm one of your hosts, DM Mitch.
And I am DM Chris. Mitch, it feels like it's been forever since we've done an episode together. It's good to be back.
I know, it really does. But it's good to be chatting with you, Chris, doing an episode together. And I'm really excited about this episode that we're going to talk about. Looking through the backlog, we saw that DM Neal and DM Matt from Detentions and Dragons did a past episode on TPKs. And so you can kind of consider this episode to be kind of a part 2 on that. Mm-hmm. What we're going to be talking about today is what happens when a TPK happens in your game, in your campaign, in your adventure. You're in the middle of telling a story, or maybe you're like at the very end and it's like, oh gosh, like what do I do now? All the PCs are dead. Do we just let the story die? We're going to talk about ways that you continue the story today with having a TPK. One of the things that we're not going to be doing is we're not going to be like giving you the option of the classic, like, well, they all wake up and they're actually not dead. They were hit with bludgeoning weapons in a dungeon somewhere. We're not going to be. This is the characters actually go through a TPK. The players actually have a TPK. How do you continue the adventure? We've got 9 ways to talk with you guys about. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, same. But in order to do that, Mitch, it means we have to go to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meat?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
All right, so we, like we said in the beginning, are going to talk about TPKs because sometimes our players make dumb decisions and sometimes it's not dumb decisions. It's just the luck of the rolls of the dice, right?
It's just the luck of the rolls.
But what we don't want to do is we don't want to pull the classic idea of like, oh, well, we'll just retcon things, or we'll get all the way down to the end of a battle and just fudge rolls so that our players don't get hit a whole bunch of times, or whatever sorts of things that we could. We want to try and actually fully explore what that looks like and feels like for us as a DM. So like Mitch said, we came up with 9 ideas. We'll see where those take us. There may end up being more than that, but from the start, out of the gate, we have 9. And so Mitch, why don't you start us off with the first one? What's the first one that we have on our list?
Well, even before we jump in, like we'll jump in a second, but I guess I just want to ask you, Chris, like, do you fear a TPK as a DM? Like you're weaving this story with your players. You know, you and I were DMs. A lot of our listeners are DMs. Mm-hmm. We all have different techniques of how we prepare. And but I'm going to wager that a lot of us DMs out there, we spend a lot of time thinking about the story that's being told and ways that we could go depending on the player's choices. And then a TPK would happen, and that would all potentially be done. Is this something that you've feared before or had at the table? Like, oh no, is this going to happen right now? What do I do?
I don't necessarily fear it. I think there's just like a deeper level of like, man, I would be really disappointed if that happened because I love the stories that I get to tell, I get to like help craft with the players. And I think that would be the biggest thing that I would fear is like, oh, this is getting so good. You know, like I don't want this to end. But there's also times where it's like, man, you made really dumb decisions. Like you have consequences for those things. Like I don't fear those moments.
Or as you said, it like, yeah, I guess does that make it better if it's like the PCs, the players like made decisions that you're like, well, you guys like made your bed. Like, I guess that makes it better, I guess. I don't know if it does.
For me, like there's I think about it in a couple different avenues. Like if my players make really dumb decisions, that's the consequences that they have to live with. If I create an encounter that's too overpowering, I can recognize that pretty early from the beginning of an encounter and be like, I probably need to nerf this because it should not be something that like. But there's also the side of it that's like, if things just roll really, really well, like, and it seemed to be a fairly balanced encounter at the beginning, like I kind of got to let it play out in the end and see what happens. You know, like. You can only fudge things, so not even fudge, but you can only try and balance things so far before it's finally like, okay, the dice are rolling specifically poorly for my players and really well for me tonight. And there's nothing that I can do about that. I can't keep nerfing things into the ground in order for this not to happen, you know?
Well, and like you're saying, we've all had as DMs experiences where the players are just rolling terrible and like it's really sucky for them. But like if I'm sitting there as a player and I'm rolling crit ones and misses, and I feel like the battle isn't going poorly, I'm starting to wonder, is the DM fudging things so that like things don't go poorly for us? And that I don't like. I want like there needs to be consequences. It's a game. There's dice rolled.
I think there's also with players that like I could also encourage them to run away. Being like, this is not the way that this is supposed to go. Like, I mean, think about it. Like if you're in a battle and all of a sudden it's not playing out in your favor, it's like, I might think about running away, you know, but like our players don't often do that. They'll like fight tooth and nail to the end. And like, there's that encouragement where it's like, okay, I can step out of like DM land and be like, hey, you guys can keep doing this. Or like, honestly think about what your characters would do. Like, I don't know many people that would fight to not see another day. You know?
Well, yeah, and I think like I'm with you. I think it's more of a disappointment, that feeling if it happens. Like, and I've definitely had moments where we've come close to a TPK, and I've wondered, oh gosh, what do we do if this happens? What do I do as a DM? Because most of the stories that I've been telling with my players, like I'm just not okay with just saying, all right, we're done. Like we're not going to continue that tale. So let's dive into some of the potentials for like a TPK happens. How do you continue a story? So we've got 9 ideas, as Chris said, that we're going to talk about. And I think from these 9 ideas, it'll kind of branch off into all these other kind of ideas as we talk. But so the first one is that the party dies. There's a TPK. And I think this one's really easy to implement if the story, the campaign has had some sort of directive from some sort of powers that be, whether it's gods or angels, devils, eldritch horrors. But like the idea is there's a deal made with some greater power. And so this greater power like is going to bring you back to continue the campaign, the mission, the quest. But I think that the word that I would really hinge on here is deal. Like it's not just a like, hey, you died. I really need this to happen. Let me bring you back to life. Maybe there hasn't been any interaction with this powerful being before, and this is like an offer made. I'll bring you back to life if this. So first, what are your reactions to this kind of an idea of continuing a story?
My mind goes in a really fun direction. So, you know, it's the idea of collateral, right? When you sign up for like a loan or something like that, like, hey, yeah, we can do this, but like it's kind of risky because we already signed a deal with you once. And so give us some collateral. So I like the idea of doing this in secret from the rest of the players, like having a god like or an eldritch horror or whatever it is.
Like this. Yeah.
And the players get to decide whether or not they want to take the deal. They can pass into the afterlife or they can come back. And so you might get a party that's like 3 of the 5 decide to come back. And so now 2 players are playing new characters, or they have to go out and seek new characters in order to come back into this story, you know, which could be really interesting because you could do that through like text message. You could do like a Zoom call once throughout the week, or, you know, get coffee or whatever it is if you're playing in person. Like, I think that could be really fun of saying like, yeah, only 2 of the 5 decided, or only 1 of the 5 decided to come back. You know, like it's that big of a deal breaker. You know, it could be really fun and interesting.
Yeah. And I had that kind of thought. I wrote that in my notes for like a lot of these is what if a player doesn't want to, right? What if there's a TPK? Because there is an element to what we're talking about. A lot of these, there is an element to, I could see a player being like, but a TPK happens. It should be done. Or I don't want my character to continue. They're dead. She's dead. He's dead. Like, I don't want it to continue. I think you need to like roll with that and be okay with that. And ultimately, like, I mean, we'll get to talking more about this, but you may have, what if you have this brilliant idea and you go, okay, a deal with power, and none of your characters want to do it? Well, then that tells you something. But yeah, I love your idea of doing the separate rather than coming back to the table and having a session and pulling them each aside. having like some time away from the table where you talk about it with the players. And so when you guys all come back to play, nobody knows who's going to be coming back to life, who's made a deal, what the deals are. So yeah, like is this player going to be playing a whole different character now that we're going to have to bring into the story? Like, is my friend gone like while I'm coming back? And yeah, what is the deal, I think is important, because I think one thing we talked about in preparing for this episode is if a TPK happens, there needs to be some sort of consequence to the story. There needs to be something felt. And so I don't think that with this idea that we're putting forward, it should just be a simple, well, I'll bring you back to life because it's important to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, you could make those deals any number of things, right? Like you could, depending on who that person is, like they could now come back with warlock powers, right? Like you could say, hey, in order to do this, you need to sacrifice some of your current levels to now switch over to being a warlock for a few levels, right? And that may require you to be doing side missions for said deity or archfey or devil or whatever. You could be that it's some physical deformity, like you're, for whatever reason, like you now have lost the ability to use your left hand or something, like it could be that the ask is so great that it's like the life of somebody that you care about has to be used as collateral. Yeah.
I mean, I even just think it might change the very course of the campaign in a sense if you're, like, I mean, I'm thinking about an item like the Ring of Power from Lord of the Rings, right? And your campaign was to destroy this powerful item. Well, a deity, a devil, some sort of powerful being might bring you back to life and say, yeah, I'll bring you back to life, but now you're going to be working for me. And at the end of this quest, you're going to give me that item. And there might be like a lot of back and forth here. Your players might be like, well, we're not going to do that. Our whole point is to like destroy it. And I could see like an evil being being like, well, listen, here's the deal I'll make with you. Time means nothing to me. What if I promise you 1,000 years after you give me this item that I will not use this item and will wreak no havoc? This is a better deal than you're going to get anywhere else. Like if you guys are just dead, especially if this is like a nobody else knows about this, like it's going to fall in the wrong hands. Like, so at least you're promised 1,000 years of peace here, right? Like this, it could be a really difficult. And the thing I like about that is wondering how that turns into role play with your characters going forward.
I think that's exactly it. I think it gives you way more fun opportunities for stories to be developed, right? That other people don't know about. I think every player would know that there was some sort of deal struck, especially if they struck one of like, I wonder what the other person's deal is, Well, and certainly you don't have to do it individually. Like having like some of these options, it might be interesting to have it as a group and have them debate, and especially to watch like certain PCs say, no, I'm not taking part of this and fade into the afterlife. Like that's a powerful moment in itself. And part of the contingency, the deal you could have is you can't tell anybody about this, or, you will instantly die or, whatever it is as part of the collateral.
Yeah. Like whoever the being is, like you can't speak their name. Like physically you cannot. Like if you try to tell somebody about this, like you just get like a pain. Like, yeah, I like that a lot.
Or you lose your voice or whatever, whatever it might be, some sort of voodoo type stuff where you all of a sudden feel an excruciating pain like in your chest or something like that. It's like, all right, never mind. I'm done.
So another option that we have, and I think this is one of the more obvious ones, is that there's some sort of escape from the afterlife. Your characters are dead. They now have moved on to the afterlife, and they recognize, oh gosh, like we didn't fulfill that quest, that mission. People are in danger. We need to do this. And so they're in the afterlife and they need to escape it. And I say afterlife because I think that you have in D&D, you have so many options of what afterlife means. But I think the classic is like, right, you're escaping the underworld. And so you're fighting your way through hell. And let's be honest, that's pretty cool. But I'm also wondering, what does it look like to have like a side adventure where you're escaping like a heavenly place, right? Like that I would imagine maybe it would be more like negotiations of sort with angels and such, but maybe it just turns into a slash and burn in heaven, which they're just like, get them out of here.
Well, yeah, I mean, it could be that sort of thing where it's like, regardless of if you're on either side of the afterlife, like I can't imagine that it's smiled upon to say, yeah, people can come and go freely. Oh, right. Yeah. So like, it's probably going to be a fight either way, right? Regardless, like you'll either have angels fighting you to prevent you from leaving, or you're going to have demons fighting you to prevent you from leaving, because that doesn't look great on anybody. And if one person can do it, everybody can do it, you know? Like it can't be a great thing to have happen.
No, that like talking about consequences too. Like, I mean, you've just blown my mind with that idea, because I think when you escape the afterlife, it shouldn't be over. Like you should be going through the campaign now, and maybe it's more difficult because every now and then an angel just appears to be like, you know, you like, how dare you do what you've done? I'm bringing you back, or devils, like, but you now not only have whatever the enemies of the campaign or the obstacles of the campaign were before, but now you have literal afterlife creatures, beings coming after you for breaking the laws of death.
Well, not only that, but it signals to other people too, like that if there's a way out, there's a way in. And there's some really powerful mortals who would love to be able to get in some way, shape, or form. I also imagine that this could turn into like a heist campaign of like, all right, let's figure out which really rich people have died too early and bring their souls back so they can give us tons of money.
A heaven heist? Heaven heist. That's the campaign name. I love that idea. That's totally different than what I was thinking we'd be talking about.
I just imagine my players currently in my campaign are super opportunists like that. So I could totally see something like that happen. And they're like, wait a minute, we could totally make some coin here. Let's do this.
This is like, I'm thinking about like in an Inception like movie, except they're not dunking themselves into water. They're literally killing each other and being like, we hope you come back, and you come back with something amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. It's plug into the Matrix, except for plugging into the Matrix is dying and then coming back.
Oh
right?
Man, my brain is running. This is going to be another one of those episodes where like I'm just like, oh great, now I have 10 other new campaign ideas that I'll never get around to.
It feels like a really fun one shot to do.
Yeah.
At some point, or like mini campaign, right? Like I don't know if I could make that a whole campaign, but doing like a one-off, like small series in between, you know, planning from one campaign to the next could be really interesting. I think along the same lines too, there's, instead of like just escaping, I think there's the general, like, what does the afterlife look like? Like, depending on what it is, like, could it possibly be a campaign where you explore? Like, if you're an adventurer, is it a place where you go where you can endlessly adventure?
Yeah.
You know? And there's tons of opportunities, and you can still play the same characters, but you're just now in the afterlife and you get to build that out as a DM. Like, I think that could be a really interesting space, regardless of if that's people dying and going to, you know, what would be paradise, or somewhere, you know, dying and going to the opposite of paradise, right? Or is there an in-between space that like like a purgatory where you're kind of living a life and you have to accomplish something as an adventurer in order to continue on to the next phase? And what does that look like, you know?
Yeah, I think that the question with the explore the afterlife continuation of the story is like, what kind of story were you telling? If it's a story in which you had like this big goal and the players have been really focused on this, and all of a sudden it shifts and it's like, okay, now we're going, not just, but we're going to transition. It kind of changed the story, and now we're going to be exploring the afterlife. Some of the players might be like, well, so we're not like ever going to find out. And I think you have two options. I think, well, now you've just created two campaigns that you can kind of go off of other things that we're going to talk about, ways to continue a story, but also continue the story you're in with the players that you're in and do an afterlife exploration. Mm-hmm. But also I think that if you're playing in a game that's more sandboxy, and the stakes aren't that high. We're not talking about world-ending stakes here. Why not just transition into a fun afterlife adventure? And fun doesn't mean that it has to be lighthearted at all. Like, it can be all sorts of different things. Like we've said, like D&D has a lot of different options for what afterlife is.
Yeah, I mean, stuff that happens in the realm of the gods influences the mortal world all the time. So does the actions that your characters have in exploring the afterlife. Like, does it affect the rest of the things that still happen, even though their characters aren't there anymore? Like, are there ways in which their actions in the heavenly realms, could they try and influence people in specific ways to pay attention to? Like, there's probably no shortage of things that you could do that could influence the way things play out on the world below, or, adjacent to, or however you want to see the afterlife, that could influence, even though they're gone from their current quest, that could still influence it in some way, shape, or form. Even if it is just a mini quest where it's like, hey, this is important enough to our characters that we need to bring this to the attention of the right people in the afterlife to do something about it. And then that's where the campaign ends. And you don't know what happens after you've tried to influence the right people with the right information, So it's like a mini session afterwards for a little bit to say, like, look, this is important enough that we have to know this god specifically about it to hopefully do something and influence the world.
I like that a lot.
And then we don't know, what happens.
It's not escape the afterlife so that we can continue the mission. It's we need to communicate. People don't know, and we need to pass this message on that we have died and pass this quest on to those in the living world. And I think that you've hit upon something there and going, okay, like a god, right? Like, who controls this realm of the underworld may have the ability to just communicate freely with mortals. I mean, you're not able to, I would imagine the rules of death would be you're not able to typically do that. I mean, there are D&D spells that allow you to communicate with the dead, but that kind of depends on the living trying to do that with the dead. I kind of like the idea of, having this this adventure that it's like, oh, we have to now go and figure out how do we communicate with these people or this person and let them know danger is still ahead. We are no longer alive to fight this battle. You need to continue it for us.
Yeah, I think that could be really interesting. Which, I mean, you could even do as a DM, somebody stumbles across your players' bodies in the ways that it does end is, you guys are exploring the afterlife or whatever, and then all of a sudden they hear a voice, or they're like just pulled out and back, and they have to talk as someone undead to pass the message along. Like, if somebody's asking the question, what happened here, then they have to explain in however many words they get, or in the 1 minute or whatever it is. I can't remember the exact rules of the spell, but then they have to be on the receiving end of having speak with undead cast on them, and they have to communicate their adventure that way,
Yeah, we've got kind of a order on our list, but let's jump ahead a couple, because I think this is a good transition into what we have as another option is the quest continues, but with new adventurers. And we have all different ideas that we were talking about of how this could happen. So we're talking about still same quest, but now you've got all new PCs. I think this is a great example of a way that you could do it is you pick up after a TPK with these old PCs in the afterlife, and maybe you do a whole session where it's they're exploring the afterlife, and all your players, you told them hey, come up with new characters, and so they were thinking, oh, we're gonna come to the table and be it's just starting new characters. How's the DM gonna do this? And then you say, no, you guys, I told you to still bring your old PCs too. We're starting out with your old PCs. We're in the afterlife. You play a whole session, and then at the end of the session, you have that moment where it's or you look for that moment that's good to be all of a sudden you're pulled away. You feel yourself departing from the afterlife, and now you're back in the mortal realm, but you look at your hands and you can see through them, and you're speaking now to the characters that the players
but
have
you could almost say like, but everything is like, you're like colorblind. Like everything is just gray.
Yeah.
There's no color, no vibrancy left to the world.
Yes.
It's just gray.
Yeah.
And you feel as if your arms are more sluggish and they're tight and they don't move quite as well, you know, or whatever it might be. And then you see 5 adventurers standing in front of you. And it looks familiar because it's the place that you had recently died.
Yeah. And now you are saying, okay, like this is on you guys as players. Like, pass the torch here. Like, what do your souls say to this adventuring group that are just like, oh, I wonder how these people died. Oh, it's fresh. Let's see if we can talk to dead. Oh, they did. Like, and now it's like, you need to do this. Like, you need to take this torch. I like that a lot.
Could be really fun. Yeah, I like that idea. And even if your players, like, you know, you could look at their character sheets beforehand and say, hey, you know, they don't have the speak with undead spell prepared or able to have, but maybe somebody has that scroll in their inventory for the specific purpose, right? Like they are going out and adventuring. They might come across something that they might want to speak with. And so this is a common scroll that they would buy, you know, or whatever, however you want to work that.
Yeah. Hey, it's a magical world. We can chalk it up to fate if we want to, right? Like nobody cast a spell, nobody had a scroll, but it's a cool, I don't think any of your players are going to walk away from that being like, nobody cast Speak with Dead. That was stupid. They're going to like you can say, yeah, how did that work? I don't know. There must be, maybe somebody's looking out for you guys. Maybe destiny, you know, it is a magical world and there's different ways you can kind of go around that. But what are some other ways that you would see like continuing a story, continuing a quest with new adventurers that it would make sense?
I think there's the classic trope of like, if you were employed by a really powerful wizard or whatever, they'll probably find other people. But even if there's not, like, there's really powerful wizards that are watching the world all the time, you know, and they could very easily see like, oh, that quest that they were going on is super important. And even though, like, I mean, you could have it where all of a sudden you get to introduce a really powerful mage in your world by rallying some people around and saying, like, it could be really interesting to explore the world through that lens of like, oh, people watch us, what we're doing, you know, like we were being watched before by a really powerful mage. I
mean, heck, if one of the players wants to play a wizard, there's the wizard that was watching them the whole time, right? Like that's an in, and like then they have to go and recruit. Like,
yeah. So I think that's a really easy one to be able to incorporate into campaign. Yeah.
Or speaking of watching, like we've already talked about, like powerful beings like gods and angels and devils and things. Like, again, like if they are concerned about the quest being fulfilled, they could go and speak and bring together a new adventuring party, or just word of mouth. Like, this is something that's well known and your group is well known and all of a sudden your group is dead. Well, new adventurers need to rise to the occasion or bad things are going to happen. Or there could be a guild like that your group was part of. I think there are a lot of options for having it happen, to have a new adventurers continue the quest, depending on what the quest is. I think there are a lot of ways to make that make sense.
One of the interesting ideas that you had, Mitch, was this idea, too, of kind of like, we kind of talked about the whole raising, like, speak with undead thing. But, you know, you had kind of taken it further with another idea, kind of around the undead, and we kind of call it the Dead Rise, you know, thinking of like an undead campaign or Dark Souls-esque.
Yes.
So you kind of share a little bit about what you were thinking with that.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, like I came across this idea. A lot of these ideas that we've compiled, like at least for me, like I kind of did a lot of searching online and came up with certain ideas from other people's ideas. And one that I came across was continuing the adventure, but your PCs are undead. So I think the question there lies, what brings them back or who brings them back? And the big thing, the big thing I would again go back to is some sort of consequence, right? So what is the consequence to being undead? I mean, roleplay wise, there's a lot of consequences. If you're a zombie guy, you're not going into a town as easy as you were when you were just an elf, right?
Yeah, is your skin now cold to the touch so you can't have physical interactions with people?
Yep. Right? Does it start rotting and falling off? Are like zombie guy, skeleton guy, ghost, like some sort of undead? And yeah, I couldn't help but like think about this and think about Dark Souls, which I know Neal has said before that we need to just do an episode because I love Dark Souls so much on doing a Souls type D&D game. I'm down for that. We'll have to do that in the future. But yeah, like in Dark Souls, it really has this. Your character is like, typically it's a type of undead called the Hollow, and they're able to regain their humanity at times. You could have some sort of element of that. You could look at a lot of the Souls games for inspiration on that. But I think that there would be a major shift the way the campaign is played out. If you're talking about 4 or 5 or whatever your group size is now, undead adventurers. They are who they were, but they're dead.
Yeah. And is the consequence of being undead, is it having to essentially harvest more souls in order to refill your own soul, right? So is that the part of the consequence?
Imagine
that's like,
a paladin who now has to, I need to fulfill this quest, but to do this, the terrible things I need to do for the greater good.
Well, not only that, but does it, so in harvesting a soul or whatever, does your weapon now all of a sudden become a soul harvesting weapon, right? Like that's part of the curse of what it is, right?
Everybody gets a soul harvesting weapon.
You continue, yeah, but you continue through the campaign and it requires you to like take out the enemies that you were already taking out, and it harvests part of their soul or whatever, and it refills you. But what happens if there's a long stretch of time where you're not harvesting it and you try to harvest like an animal or whatever, but it doesn't do nearly as much as like a humanoid soul, right? And now you're not in the throes of harvesting bad people's souls, and now you're stuck with, well, I'm dying now. Like, I'm running out of time. What do I do? Do I harvest a random townsperson's soul in order to survive? Like what do I have to do now, in order to continue on with this quest, because now I have this soul harvesting requirement on my being,
Oh my gosh, it's really so brilliant. Because I'm just sitting here and going, yeah, well, and what does harvesting a soul mean? Does it mean that soul is obliterated and no longer goes to the afterlife? And I asked that question because, well, I guess you could just say you could say, well, it's a mercy because the people that I'm going to be harvesting the souls from are the enemies of the campaign, and they're bad guys. They're just really evil doers. Like, so actually I'm doing them a mercy because otherwise they'd go to the underworld or whatnot.
Well, and does it require like weird new battle tactics where it's like, oh, well, our barbarian is right in the front and he's going to get a ton, but now he has to like allow the mage to get one, right? And so like there's the weird like, okay, how many do you have? Like, do we have to like change the way we do battle tactics now in order to help our team harvest the required amount?
The barbarian's got to grapple a guy at the end of every battle and push him towards the mage and be like, you need to take your dagger and shove it into, but also I'm thinking like how many good stories also are the opposition force, right? They don't have to be evil people, or evil beings. Like sometimes there's just differences of opinions. Sometimes there's good people fighting for the wrong reason or with the wrong knowledge. Mm-hmm. What happens when that is the opposition that's in your way, and you still need to, as you said, in order to remain this undead warrior to continue the quest that needs to get done, you need to harvest some souls. You need to obliterate some souls and stop them from going on to the afterlife. Man, I just love the idea of like a paladin or something having to wrestle with this. Yeah, I love it.
I mean, I think that in and of itself could be an interesting start to a campaign where it's just like you wake up, you as 4 or 5 adventurers, whatever it does, wake up in a cave and you remember all of the things that happened before, that sounds like an interesting, that just moved up the list for me it wasn't even on my list beforehand as we're just spitballing about this, but now it is definitely like, I might want to run a campaign that has that mechanic in it. Because it could be really interesting.
Yeah, and you wake up in the cave where you died, or you wake up in crawling out of a grave because your bodies were found. And you start the adventure with, we're zombie people now. We're in the middle of this huge city. How do we escape? Because if we're caught, like if people see us, they're definitely just going to kill us. We're zombies. Oh, I love it. So, Chris, you had kind of an idea too of like raising from the dead, not undead, maybe undead, but like you called it role reversal. Tell us, because I love this idea. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, it could be using that soul reversal idea, right? Like that could be part of it. But the idea was like, well, the bad guys you're fighting are pretty powerful. They probably got access to some sort of magic, and they see the competency and the skill that they have, and they want it on their side, right? And so they come along and they raise you and your characters from the dead. And now you have to serve them in their quest, fully knowing that before you were trying to prevent them from doing this, but now you're given the option, maybe not even given the option, but there's some sort of collateral that was tied to you, whether it's the death of your family or, whatever it was, that now you have to serve them and accomplish their tasks that you were then, before you died, trying to fight against so powerfully. I think they could just create a really interesting, like, indentured servitude sort of role that everyone hates, but there's something that more valuable tied to it that they can't not serve this now enemy who just had plunged the sword into their chest or whatever. It could be really interesting.
Oh, and talking about, again, consequences or just shifts in the story, like it doesn't, when I say consequence too, I don't necessarily always mean, oh, this is going to hurt for your players, like they're going to hate it. But I think consequence meaning that when you have a TPK, it's not just shrugged off. There's a big change.
Right.
And I think that this is a big change. Like you've literally just gone and swapped it. And yeah, like you said, like, is this something that now your players are just on board and they're like, okay, the story has changed. We're now fighting on the other side and we are fully in it. Or is there some sort of coercion there and part of the story is trying to break out of the confines of this to help, again, the side that they came from?
Or do they not remember any of their previous life? Like they have to play as players where they don't remember anything before this moment,
and then
right?
they get
and
glimpses,
they just start serving,
maybe, or they run across people that knew them.
Anytime they come back to something familiar, part of the memory comes back, right?
Now that's a tough one, I'd say, that you need to know, as we've said many times over the years in the show, know your players, because that's going to be one where you want your players to be good at not metagaming. Like,
having enough of the cognitive dissonance there to not bring back old memories that prevent them from doing what they're supposed to be doing as characters. Yeah,
like I've seen too often at the table the like rationalization of like a little clue is given and it's like there's metagaming knowledge. It's like, well, I think my character would get to that point because of this, and they have figured it out now. And it's like, I don't think they would with that. Like, just know your players. Know if they're going to be good at being able to separate that metagaming knowledge and really lean into the role playing. I think they're going to have to be players that want to embrace this idea of, I've forgotten. I don't know that life.
Yeah, I think it could be a really, really fun idea. Another idea, Mitch, that I know we had talked about briefly, and I know you kind of did in a campaign, is this idea around a vision.
Yep.
So why don't you say a little bit about that, what you're intending and meaning by that? Yeah,
the vision idea is maybe the most, there wasn't an actual TPK out of all of these. And that I ran a campaign where I built the story around these PCs. It was really important that these PCs be a part of the story. And so the question is, well, what if one of them dies? I had this mechanic built into the campaign, which didn't come up except for on 2 occasions. The first time it came up was really late into the game, where there was a TPK and one of the characters was a prophet. And so they would see visions of the future. And so what I did with this TPK was it actually turned out that this was everything that had been played up to that point was a vision from this prophet character. And so the TPK happened, and this prophet character like kind of came out of their vision, and they were like back at the start of the adventure and looking around, and they've literally lived a life with these other PCs, and the other PCs are waiting for the adventure to begin. We did not play through the adventure all the way again. That would be tedious and terrible. We all know a terrible time loop TV show or movie when we see it, when it's like we see things over and over again too much that it's like frustrating. What I did go for with that is I would ask specifically the one character who's a prophet, is there anything you'd try to do different this time? And so we would pick up like different moments in the story if they were trying to do something different and see how that ripple affected. But yeah, it is the least there's an actual TPK that's actually happened out of all of these ideas. And I'd say don't use it more than once. If you're going to use it, maybe establish that there's actually a prophet in the group and kind of allude to it before just being like, oh, guess what? You're a prophet and you just had this vision.
Right. Yeah. Because then there's a new mechanic at play there, or there's a recklessness that then your players will be like, oh, well, maybe this is just another vision or whatever. You know, who knows?
And I think
for sure.
we've got
could be really interesting.
We've got two more. One is the worst timeline. So this whole concept bases on the fact that there's a TPK. You failed the adventure. The quest fails. The bad thing happens. The thing, I guess it doesn't have to be bad, but the thing you were trying to prevent happens. And the world goes on, but we're going to continue the story. And I think with this idea, both of us were thinking more along the lines of like, it's new characters, but a continuation of the story with the fact that the thing that you were trying to prevent actually occurs. And so the world has completely changed. And so you have maybe a new divergent of the story that is now the worst timeline where terrible things have happened. And now you've got to tell a different story of correcting the wrongs, fixing the problem.
Mm-hmm. And I know we've talked about this before, Mitch, and I think both of us have had this in our worlds for a while, but I think the show Loki kind of solidified it for what it would look like for me in my mind of like, I said this to a player the other day when we were talking about some of the stuff that's happening in our campaigns. And I said, you know, the world of Austera kind of works like that show where there's like the one true timeline. If everything went the way that it was supposed to, it would go this way, right? But every time like we as players come and play, depending on how the campaign ends out, it's a divergency, right? Like it's a differing thing that happens potentially, you know, depending on what your choices were. There are different concepts, and every time that happens, there's a different branching universe.
Yes.
You know,
yeah.
And so it's an interesting way of thinking about like, now that your players have failed, you could go 10 years in the future. Sure. You could go 100 years in the future,
1,000,
whatever it is, and pick it up and be like, here's how it's played out since then. Like you give the history of the world to that point, and you specifically kind of say, here's what happened in this period of time. You don't necessarily have to mention the old players' characters. Yeah. And say that they failed.
But you could.
But like in the year of 800, you know, whatever, the underworld was unleashed if that was what your players were trying to prevent. And now they know, oh, it ended up happening.
Yeah.
And since then, here's the consequences of what that has caused, right? And we pick up with your characters here, currently enslaved to a small group of demons that are now roaming around the world, you know? And that's where you pick up, right? I mean...
Well, and I think what that accomplishes is it is ultimately a continuation of the story. It's not just like, because the other option is what? We've given a lot of options, but one of the other options is you failed, you're dead, the campaign's over. All right, I guess let's make new characters and start a different story. Sure, you can do that, and we'll talk about that maybe in a second. I think in doing this, yes, is it a different story? Yeah, kind of. Is it all new characters? Yeah. Is it, like you said, could it potentially be 1,000 years into the future and be very, very different? Yes. But you're not just saying all that was for nothing. We're going to now see the consequences of this failure, and we're gonna start this story now surrounding that. And so it does feel like a continuation. It does feel like you're not throwing out something, but you're continuing on and telling more stories from it. So, all right, Chris, you've got one last idea for this. I love this one.
Yeah.
What's this last idea for how to continue a story after a TPK?
Don't continue it.
Okay.
In any way, shape, or form, like, and I think the as I was thinking about it as you were talking, I was like, I think the multiverse idea gives you the ability to do this, right? Like, you say all of a sudden, like, all right, we're going to start a new campaign, and it's like 100 years into the future, but nothing has changed, right? And it looks similar to what your players did, and they're going to be like, like metagaming, like, wait, what? Nothing changed? And it's a little way to like start to, mess with how the universe of your world works or whatever. But it could just be one of those things where it's like, no, I mean, you just don't. You do leave them hanging. Like, I mean, their players after they die wouldn't know what happened. So we're going to go and do a campaign from 300 years before these characters existed, right? And they just don't know what happened there.
Yeah.
And I think there's the intrigue, right, of like, that's why we long for sequels of things. When like the third book of a series, the King Killer Chronicles, not to mention one, doesn't ever come out and we don't know what happens. It's like, what's going to happen to these characters? And you just don't know, right? Like, it's the ultimate cliffhanger because your characters didn't get there. Now they just don't know what happens. And you just start a new campaign 100 years in the future, or in the past.
Well, it sounds like what you're even talking about is not even, once again, like the idea of, and I hate, maybe I shouldn't use this word because you sat down with your friends and you hopefully had fun. So the idea of like throwing an adventure out, doesn't maybe ring true to that. But yeah, like it doesn't sound like you're saying that. You're even leaving it open to be like, yeah, if you play enough adventurers with these players, maybe hints will start to come in time, or maybe that's the point, is that your players have to kind of make up in their minds what exactly happened.
Or it could be one of those things like, what was the Chris Pratt movie that just came out where they went back into the past and recruited people to come to the future or whatever?
I haven't seen it. But.
Tomorrow War or whatever it was. I started watching it and then stopped.
That sounds about
super intrigued by
That's pretty much what I expected. That's why I didn't even say it.
But I think there could be something to that where it's like, that idea of the prophet somewhere, or the vision, or the powerful mage or whatever can watch back through time and say, here's some adventurers that like, now all of a sudden I'm calling people from the past into the future to come and do this. Like, you leave them hanging for 10 sessions or so of like just kind of sandbox exploring. And then all of a sudden they come across the cave with like, some sort of mystical presence in there that's calling them into the future or whatever. And that's where they get the finality to the story as different characters or whatever. To not fully leave them hanging, but to like do the cliffhanger for a long period of time and then say, all right, we're jumping back in to that space,
Or also kind of, going back to number one, the thing we talked about, a deal with power. We threw out the option that none of the characters want to take the deal. What do? You force it? Like, I say no. Like, there may be multiple indications that it's time to put a bow on this story and wrap it up. Maybe it hasn't been super fun. Maybe there's been a couple reasons. We've talked about lots of that on the show. We're not going to go into the details of that today, but sometimes maybe the answer is don't, and that's what it is. Maybe all of you, okay, including you as a DM, are ready to move on to a different adventure. Well, we hope that you've enjoyed this episode of the Dungeon Master's Block. I hope that, as always, your mind is just full of all different ideas of adventures you can tell, and maybe just adventures that you can tell once there's a terrible TPK in your story. Chris, I think you and I both are leaning towards that like undead one. Like, I'm definitely thinking that might be the next adventure, like that I'm just going to throw challenges at them hardcore and watch as then the story turns into like zombies like fleeing in a city. But if you've liked this episode, if you like our past episodes or future episodes that we haven't recorded yet, or we have our future selves had, and you have listened to them, please head over to your podcatcher app of choice and give us a review. It helps our show reach other people, potential new DMs, old DMs, people who haven't figured out the joy of DMing yet. Give us a hand by doing that.
You can find us on Twitter as well. It's at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. Come and hit us up on there. See the fun stuff that we post on there and join the community conversation. You can also reach out to us through our email. It is dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. You can tell us some more of your fun ideas about how you've handled TPKs or ideas that you just have in general. And we just love to reach out. You just love when you reach out and we can chat with you. So hit us up there as well.
As always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out other shows like Detentions and Dragons, Geek Wars, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and more.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we come to talk about the most important person in the game, the Dungeon Master. Have a great night, everyone.
And always keep on dungeon mastering.
Goodbye.